At our anniversary dinner, my husband laughed with his friends as he handed me divorce papers. His mistress sat beside him wearing my necklace. They toasted to their love while I sat there forgotten. I signed quietly, smiled, and then did something that made every one of them wish they hadn't laughed. Julian raised his champagne glass at our anniversary dinner and announced to the entire table that they should toast to new beginnings, and I watched his friends laugh while his assistant Penelope sat beside him wearing my grandmother's diamond necklace like a trophy she'd earned. The divorce papers he slid across the white tablecloth had sticky notes marking where I should sign, and Marcus was already recording on his phone to capture my humiliation for whatever group chat they'd share it in later. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to beg. They wanted to watch me fall apart in front of everyone who'd come to witness my public destruction. Instead, I picked up my pen and signed every page while they watched in confused silence, because what none of them knew was that I'd spent 8 months preparing for this exact moment. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories of resilience and justice. If you believe that betrayal should never go unanswered, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear this. Now let's see what happened next. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up at that table signing divorce papers while my husband's mistress wore my family heirloom, you need to understand what came before. You need to know about the marriage I thought I had, the life I believed we were building together, and the exact moment when everything I trusted turned out to be carefully constructed lies. Julian and I met 4 years earlier at a community fundraiser for downtown revitalization. I was there representing the city planning department, presenting proposals for affordable housing that wouldn't displace existing residents. He showed up as a volunteer, talking about architectural design with enough passion that people gathered around him like he was discussing adventure travel instead of zoning regulations. He found me afterward near the refreshment table and asked intelligent questions about my work that made me feel seen in ways I hadn't experienced before. Most men I dated either found urban planning boring or felt threatened by a woman who talked about municipal codes with genuine enthusiasm. Julian seemed different. He listened when I spoke. He asked follow-up questions. He treated my career like it mattered. We dated for 18 months before he proposed at Bellacourt, the upscale steakhouse with crystal chandeliers and prices that required careful budgeting for people like us who worked regular jobs and paid student loans. He'd reserved a corner table, ordered champagne I knew he couldn't really afford, and gotten down on one knee in front of strangers who applauded when I said yes. The ring wasn't expensive, but it was thoughtful, a simple band with a small diamond that he'd saved for months to buy. I wore it proudly because it represented something I'd started to believe might be real. A partnership with someone who saw me as an equal rather than an accessory to his life. Our wedding was small, held in my grandmother's garden 6 months later. She was still alive then, though already sick with the cancer that would take her 8 months after our vows. She wore her diamond necklace that day, the heirloom that had been passed through 4 generations of women in our family. After the ceremony, she took it off and placed it around my neck, her hands shaking slightly from the medication but her voice steady when she told me what it meant. This necklace had survived the Depression when my great-great-grandmother pawned everything else to keep her children fed but refused to sell this one piece. It had survived World War II when my great-grandmother wore it to her husband's funeral, and then used it as collateral for a loan to buy the house where she raised 3 children alone. It had survived my grandmother's own divorce in the 70s when her husband left her for his secretary, and she'd built a successful business from nothing while wearing this necklace to every important meeting as a reminder that she came from women who endured. When my grandmother died, I inherited that necklace along with her stories about resilience and refusing to be destroyed by circumstances or cruel men. I kept it in our bedroom safe, taking it out only for the most important occasions because it represented something more valuable than the diamonds themselves. It represented survival. It represented the strength of women who'd been knocked down and gotten back up and built lives worth living despite everything that tried to break them. Julian and I moved into the house on Maple Street 3 months after our wedding. It needed work, but the bones were solid, and we spent weekends painting walls and refinishing floors and planning the renovations we'd make once we'd saved enough money. I planted roses in the garden using techniques my grandmother had taught me before she got too sick to garden anymore. Julian talked about the home office he wanted to build, the kitchen renovation that would increase the property value, the future children who might play in that garden among the roses I was cultivating. We had separate careers, but we had dinner together most nights, talking about projects and problems and plans for the life we were supposedly building as a team. I worked long hours at the city planning department, managing development projects that required balancing neighborhood needs against developer interests and political pressure. The work was exhausting but meaningful, and Julian seemed proud of what I did. He'd ask about my day and listen to my answers. He'd offer suggestions when I faced difficult decisions. He'd celebrate my small victories like they mattered to him too. I thought we had the kind of partnership my grandmother had told me to look for, two people pulling in the same direction even when the road got difficult. For 3 years, that's what I believed we had. 3 years of what felt like a real marriage with normal problems and normal solutions. We argued sometimes about money or housework or whose family to visit for holidays, but we always worked it out. We supported each other's careers even when that meant sacrificing time together. We talked about children and retirement and growing old in the house on Maple Street. I trusted him completely because I'd never been given a reason not to, and trust is what you build a marriage on when you believe in someone enough to bet your entire future on their character. Then about 8 months before that anniversary dinner at Bellacourt, something shifted in Julian that I noticed but couldn't quite name. He started working later, coming home after 9 or 10 at night with explanations about difficult clients and project deadlines that sounded plausible enough. His architectural firm was going through a busy period, he said, competing for contracts that required extra hours and weekend work. I understood demanding careers because I had one too, so I didn't question the late nights or the weekend trips to meet with potential clients in other cities. I just adjusted our routine, eating dinner alone more often and saving conversations for the nights when he came home early enough to actually talk. He joined an exclusive gym downtown that cost more per month than our grocery budget. He hired a personal trainer and started working out before work and sometimes during lunch breaks. His body changed, becoming leaner and more defined, and he started buying clothes that showed off the transformation. Tailored suits replaced the off-the-rack blazers he'd worn before. Designer watches appeared on his wrist. He started wearing cologne that cost more than the perfume I bought myself once a year. When I commented on the changes, he explained that his firm expected a certain image for client meetings, that presentation mattered in architecture because they were selling vision and aesthetic along with structural design. It made sense in a way that allowed me to ignore the discomfort I felt watching my husband transform into someone who spent more time and money on his appearance than our mortgage payment. Our intimate life disappeared so gradually I didn't realize it was gone until months had passed without any physical connection beyond perfunctory kisses goodbye in the morning. When I tried to initiate something more, Julian had excuses that sounded reasonable individually but added up to a pattern I was determined not to see. He was exhausted from work. He was stressed about a presentation. He had an early meeting and needed sleep. He'd started suggesting I was being needy when I asked if something was wrong between us, turning my concerns into character flaws that made me question whether I was imagining problems that didn't exist. I suggested couples therapy once and he looked at me like I'd proposed something deeply offensive, asking why I always had to create drama out of nothing. So I stopped asking. I stopped initiating. I became smaller and quieter in my own home because some part of me understood that pushing would force an answer I wasn't ready to hear. Instead, I focused on work in the garden and maintaining the appearance of normalcy through sheer determination to believe that marriages went through difficult phases and came out stronger on the other side. My sister Rachel saw what I refused to acknowledge. She came to visit one Saturday when Julian was supposedly at the office, and we sat in the garden with iced tea while she asked carefully if everything was okay with my marriage. I bristled immediately, defensive in ways that proved she'd touched something true. I insisted we were fine, just busy with work and tired from the demands of adult life. Rachel had been through a divorce 2 years earlier and recognized patterns I was actively denying. She didn't push, just squeezed my hand and said she was there whenever I needed her. After she left, I stood in our kitchen looking at the life I'd constructed around Julian's preferences and schedule. The coffee maker programmed to his settings. The meal plan organized around his dietary restrictions. The carefully maintained home that felt increasingly like a stage set for a marriage that existed only in my refusal to see it had already ended. I pushed the doubts down and told myself Rachel was projecting her failed relationship onto my perfectly fine one. Then, 3 days before our 4th anniversary, Julian sent me a text message while I was reviewing budget reports at my desk. He'd made reservations at Bellacourt for Friday night to celebrate, complete with a champagne glass emoji that felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Julian hadn't initiated a celebration in over a year. Not my birthday. Not our last anniversary. Not even Valentine's Day. The sudden enthusiasm felt manufactured, performative, like he was following a script rather than expressing genuine affection. I texted back a thumbs up because I didn't know what else to say, then sat staring at my computer screen without seeing the numbers in front of me. Something was coming. Something I'd been avoiding through busyness and denial and the desperate hope that ignoring problems would somehow solve them. That night I lay awake beside Julian while he slept peacefully, completely unaware that I was finally, terrifyingly awake to realities I could no longer pretend didn't exist. But even then, even lying there in the dark knowing something was deeply wrong, I had no idea just how calculated the betrayal had been or how long Julian had been planning my destruction. I didn't know about Penelope yet. I didn't know about the money. I didn't know about any of it. That knowledge was still 3 days away, waiting for me on a Wednesday morning that would shatter every remaining illusion I'd been clinging to about the man I'd married and the life we'd supposedly built together. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of brightness that felt insulting given what was about to happen. I woke at 5:30 to prepare for a presentation about zoning regulation changes that the city council would be voting on later that week. The project mattered. It would determine whether low-income families could remain in neighborhoods being targeted for luxury development. But my mind felt foggy from the sleepless night I'd spent lying beside Julian wondering what was coming on Friday. Julian had already left for his morning workout. At least that's what the note on the kitchen counter claimed in his neat handwriting. Early gym session back by 8. I made coffee in the machine I'd programmed to his preferred strength and temperature. Another small accommodation in the 1,000 accommodations that had defined our marriage. His laptop sat open on the kitchen table where he'd left it the night before, screen dark but still logged in based on the small light glowing on the power button. I wasn't planning to look at it. I had no reason to distrust Julian beyond vague unease and my sister's concern and the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. I reached past the laptop for the sugar bowl and my elbow brushed the touchpad. The screen illuminated instantly, displaying his email inbox in full detail. A notification banner appeared at the top of the screen. New message from Penelope Morrison. Subject line: Last night was incredible. My hand froze halfway to the sugar bowl. Penelope Morrison was Julian's executive assistant. I'd met her briefly at his firm's holiday party 6 months earlier. A woman in her late 20s with professionally highlighted hair and the kind of confidence that came from being attractive and knowing it. Julian had introduced her as efficient and professional, someone who kept his schedule organized and handled difficult clients with diplomatic skill. I'd thought nothing of her then beyond a moment of comparing myself unfavorably to her youth and polish. The email preview showed the first line: I can't stop thinking about you. When can we? I clicked before my rational mind could stop my hand. The message opened, and with it, an entire archive of correspondence that had been happening in parallel to my marriage for nearly a year. Hundreds of emails organized into threaded conversations with subject lines that told their own story: hotel confirmation for Portland trip, can't wait for this weekend, thinking about our future. I sat down at the kitchen table because my legs had stopped supporting my weight. I opened the first email thread, dated 11 months earlier, and started reading with the kind of methodical focus I usually reserved for budget reports and development proposals. Julian had written to Penelope about meeting for drinks after a client presentation. Her response suggested dinner instead. His reply agreed and added that he'd been wanting to spend time alone with her for weeks. Her response to that included a hotel address. The emails progressed with increasing intimacy and decreasing caution. They discussed Julian's unhappy marriage to a wife who didn't understand him, who was more interested in her career than in being a partner, who had become boring and predictable. Penelope wrote about how different he was from other men she'd dated, how mature and accomplished and worthy of someone who actually appreciated him. They planned weekend trips to coastal towns under the guise of client meetings. They discussed what their life would be like together once Julian finalized the divorce he was apparently planning. The most recent emails, sent within the last week, discussed Friday's anniversary dinner at Bellacourt. Penelope wrote that she was excited to finally be public with their relationship, that she couldn't wait to see the look on my face when I realized what was happening. Julian responded that he'd invited Marcus and Victoria as witnesses, along with his brother Derek for moral support. He described it as closure, as the official end of a marriage that had been dead for years. Penelope's response included details about the dress she'd bought for the occasion and her excitement about finally being able to wear the necklace Julian had given her. My grandmother's necklace. The heirloom that had survived 4 generations of women who'd endured worse than faithless husbands. Julian had borrowed it 6 months ago, claiming he wanted to have it cleaned and appraised for insurance purposes. I'd trusted him with something that represented my entire family's history of resilience, and he'd given it to his mistress like it was his to gift. I opened our joint bank account on my phone with hands that had started shaking. I'd been too trusting to monitor our finances carefully beyond confirming the mortgage payment cleared each month, and we maintained enough cushion for emergencies. What I found when I actually examined the statements made the affair seem almost secondary to the systematic financial betrayal. Charges at jewelry stores I'd never visited. $4,000 at Brennan Fine Jewelry 3 months ago. Another $2,600 at Hamilton's 2 weeks after that. Designer boutiques where I'd never shopped. Purchases ranging from $500 to $1,800, all in sizes that weren't mine. Expensive restaurants where we'd never eaten together. Bills for $200, $300, $400 at steakhouses and wine bars downtown. Hotel charges in Portland and Seattle and San Francisco during weekends when Julian claimed to be attending architecture conferences. Weekend trips to coastal resorts. A bed and breakfast in Cannon Beach for $600 per night. A boutique hotel in Carmel for $800. A luxury resort in Monterey for over $1,000. All charged to our joint credit card. All occurring during periods when Julian told me he was traveling alone for work. I pulled up our savings account next, the one we'd been contributing to for 2 years to fund the kitchen renovation I'd been planning. The account that should have contained nearly $30,000 showed a balance of $4,000. I checked the transaction history and found systematic transfers Julian had made over the last 8 months, moving money in increments of $2,000 or $3,000 into an account I didn't recognize. The complete financial picture took me nearly 2 hours to assemble, sitting at that kitchen table while my coffee went cold and the sun rose higher through the window. Julian had spent over $50,000 on his affair in the past year. Money we'd saved together. Money we'd earned through my 60-hour work weeks and his supposed commitment to our shared future. He'd been building an entirely separate life with Penelope using resources stolen from the marriage he was planning to publicly destroy on Friday. I couldn't stay in that house another second. I grabbed my purse and car keys and drove to Rachel's apartment across town, arriving before 9 in the morning without calling first. My sister opened the door in pajama pants and an oversized sweatshirt, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm when she saw my face. She pulled me inside without questions and I collapsed. Not dramatically, not with theatrical crying, but with the kind of complete physical shutdown that happens when your body finally stops pretending everything is manageable. I ended up on her living room floor with my back against the couch and I told her everything. The emails spanning a year. The hotels and restaurants and jewelry purchases. The $50,000 stolen from our joint accounts. My grandmother's necklace given to his mistress like family heirlooms were disposable trinkets. The anniversary dinner he'd planned as my public execution while his friends recorded my humiliation. Rachel sat beside me on that floor and didn't say anything for a long time. She didn't offer reassurances that Julian might have explanations or that marriages could survive affairs or any of the platitudes people say when they're uncomfortable with someone else's pain. She'd been through her own divorce 2 years earlier when her husband left her for a woman 15 years younger. She understood that some betrayals don't have explanations that matter, only consequences that need to be managed. When I finally stopped talking, Rachel made coffee and brought me a mug even though I didn't think I could drink anything past the nausea in my stomach. She sat down across from me at her small kitchen table and asked one question. "What do you want to do?" I wiped my face with the sleeve of my shirt and felt something shift inside me. The grief was still there, sharp and raw and overwhelming, but underneath it was something else. Something colder and harder that I'd never felt before but recognized immediately as the thing that would get me through this. "I don't want to accept this," I said. "I don't want to be the woman who gets destroyed while everyone watches and does nothing. I want to fight back." Rachel nodded slowly and picked up her phone. She scrolled through her contacts and held it out to me. "Then call Catherine Brennan. She's the lawyer who handled my divorce. She doesn't lose." Catherine Brennan's office occupied the 15th floor of a glass building downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city I'd spent years trying to improve through urban planning work that suddenly felt meaningless compared to the wreckage of my personal life. The receptionist showed me into a conference room where Catherine was waiting, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit that projected competence and control. She was in her mid-40s with dark hair pulled back severely and an expression that suggested she'd heard every variation of betrayal and wasn't easily shocked. Her handshake was firm enough to hurt slightly, establishing immediately that this was a woman who didn't do anything halfway. I sat across from her at the polished conference table and told my story for the second time that morning. This time I didn't cry. I kept my voice steady and presented the facts like I was giving a work presentation. The affair, the financial theft, the year of systematic deception, the anniversary dinner planned as public humiliation. Catherine took notes in precise handwriting, asking occasional questions about joint assets and account access and whether I had documentation of everything I'd discovered. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Assessment maybe. Calculation about what kind of client I would be and what kind of case we could build. I need to know something before we proceed, she said. Do you want a fair divorce settlement or do you want justice? I didn't hesitate. Both. Catherine smiled then, a sharp expression that was simultaneously terrifying and reassuring. Good, she said. Because fair is the minimum you deserve, but justice is what we're going to get you. And when we're done, your husband will regret every decision that led him to this moment. Catherine made 3 phone calls before I left her office that afternoon. The first was to a forensic accountant named Thomas Abernathy who apparently owed her a favor from a previous case. The second was to a private investigator she described as thorough and discreet. The third was to someone she referred to only as her technology specialist, and she spoke in careful language that suggested the less I knew about certain details, the better protected I would be if anyone asked questions later. She walked me to the elevator with a folder containing intake paperwork and a list of documents she needed me to gather. Bank statements going back 2 years. Tax returns. The deed to our house. Any prenuptial agreements, though I told her we hadn't signed one because we'd been too in love and too optimistic to imagine needing legal protection from each other. Insurance policies. Retirement account information. Vehicle titles. She wanted everything that proved what Julian and I owned together and what he might be hiding separately. Don't let him know you're gathering this information, Catherine said as the elevator doors opened. Don't change your behavior in any way that might alert him. You need to be exactly the wife he expects, trusting, accommodating, completely unaware that his world is about to collapse. I nodded because I understood what she was telling me even if I didn't know yet whether I could actually do it. I had to go home and pretend everything was normal while building the case that would destroy my husband. I had to smile and cook dinner and ask about his day while knowing he was texting Penelope about their future together. I had to become an actress in my own marriage, and the performance had to be flawless because Julian couldn't suspect anything until it was too late for him to protect himself. Thomas Abernathy's office was in a converted warehouse in the industrial district, tucked between a printing company and a place that repaired commercial kitchen equipment. I met him there 2 days after my initial consultation with Catherine, carrying a cardboard box filled with every financial document I'd been able to gather without arousing Julian's suspicion. Thomas was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of intense focus that came from spending entire days staring at spreadsheets looking for patterns other people missed. His office smelled like coffee that had been sitting too long and the particular stress that comes from doing detail-oriented work under pressure. Computer monitors covered every available surface, displaying columns of numbers and financial transactions that meant nothing to me but apparently told Thomas complete stories about where money came from and where it went and who was lying about both. He went through my documents with methodical efficiency, occasionally asking questions about specific accounts or transactions I couldn't explain. I watched him work for about an hour before he told me to go home and he'd call when he found something worth discussing. The way he said, when instead of if, suggested he already knew he would find evidence of financial wrongdoing. It was just a matter of documenting it thoroughly enough to hold up in court. Thomas called me 3 days later and asked me to come back to his office. I told Julian I had a dentist appointment and left work early, driving to the warehouse district with my stomach in knots because I knew whatever Thomas had found would be worse than I'd imagined. I was right. Thomas had discovered that Julian hadn't just been spending our joint money recklessly on his affair. He'd been systematically stealing from our accounts using a method designed to avoid detection. Small transfers that wouldn't trigger automatic alerts or make me question the balance when I glanced at it occasionally. $500 moved on a Monday. $1,000 on Thursday. $700 the following week. Never enough to be obvious individually, but adding up over 8 months to more than $80,000 that had disappeared into an account I'd never known existed. The account was registered in Julian's name only, opened at a different bank using our home address but paperwork sent to his office so I would never see the statements. He'd been building a financial escape plan while telling me we needed to be careful with spending, while suggesting we postpone the kitchen renovation because we should save more first, while I'd been cutting back on groceries and skipping purchases I wanted because I believed we were being responsible together. But that wasn't the worst of what Thomas found. Julian had taken out a second mortgage on our house 6 months earlier. $200,000 borrowed against the equity we'd built together, using documents that required my signature as co-owner. Thomas showed me the paperwork and I stared at a signature that looked exactly like mine but that I'd never written. Julian had forged it well enough that the mortgage company's verification process hadn't caught the fraud. That money, all $200,000 of it, had gone into investment accounts registered under Penelope Morrison's name. They'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. Not just an affair, but a complete financial strategy to leave me with nothing while they started their life together, funded by assets stolen from the marriage Julian was planning to publicly destroy. I sat in Thomas's office looking at the evidence spread across his desk and felt something crack inside me that I hadn't known could break. It was one thing to discover infidelity. It was something else entirely to realize your husband had been methodically robbing you while making you believe you were partners building a future together. Every conversation about budgeting had been a lie. Every time he'd suggested we wait on a purchase I wanted, he'd been stealing thousands of dollars for his mistress. Every moment I'd trusted him with our finances, he'd been forging my signature and committing fraud that could have destroyed my credit and left me personally responsible for debts I'd never agreed to. Thomas printed copies of everything he'd found and organized it into a folder that was already 2 inches thick with documented evidence of systematic financial betrayal. He told me he would continue investigating to make sure he'd found all the hidden accounts and fraudulent transactions, but what he had already was enough to build a criminal case if Catherine chose to pursue that route. Catherine's strategy required me to return home and act like nothing had changed. I had to be the oblivious wife Julian believed I was, the woman who trusted him completely and would never think to question his honesty. So I went back to our house on Maple Street and cooked dinner like I had hundreds of times before. I made the chicken dish Julian liked with roasted vegetables and the seasoning blend he preferred. I set the table with cloth napkins and poured wine into the glasses we'd received as wedding gifts from people who'd believed we would last. Julian came home at 8:30 smelling like Penelope's perfume, and I smiled at him like I couldn't identify the scent that had become familiar over months of late nights and poor excuses. He kissed my cheek and complimented the dinner and talked about a difficult client meeting while I nodded and asked follow-up questions and performed the role of supportive wife so convincingly that I frightened myself a little. This became my routine for the next several weeks. I woke up beside a man I was planning to destroy and made his coffee the way he liked it. I listened to his lies about where he'd been and what he'd been doing and responded with appropriate concern or interest or sympathy. I attended his firm's annual gala in a navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, standing beside him as he introduced me to clients and colleagues as his wonderful wife who supported his career so completely. Penelope was at that gala, introduced as Julian's indispensable executive assistant who kept his professional life organized and running smoothly. I shook her hand and complimented her dress and watched her eyes for any sign that she felt guilty about sleeping with my husband and spending money stolen from my accounts. I saw nothing except barely concealed satisfaction, the look of a woman who believed she'd won a prize worth having. I watched Julian and Penelope exchange glances across the room throughout the evening. Small looks that lasted only seconds but communicated entire conversations between people who knew each other intimately. I noticed other people noticing too. Colleagues who gave me sympathetic looks that suggested they'd known about the affair longer than I had. Clients who seemed uncomfortable with the obvious tension. Julian's business partner Marcus, who watched the interactions between Julian and Penelope with an expression that looked like amusement rather than disapproval. Our marriage had been a public joke, and I'd been the only person who didn't know the punchline. Catherine had also hired Michael Torres, a private investigator who'd spent 20 years in law enforcement before starting his own practice specializing in surveillance and documentation for divorce cases. Michael was in his 50s with gray hair and the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human betrayal and wasn't shocked by any of it anymore. He followed Julian and Penelope for 3 weeks, documenting their affair with the methodical precision of someone building evidence that would hold up in court. The photographs he delivered to Catherine's office were comprehensive and damning. Time-stamped images of them checking into hotels using false names. Romantic dinners at expensive restaurants where they held hands across white tablecloths and fed each other dessert like teenagers. Weekend trips to Penelope's family lake house where they walked on the dock and kissed in the sunset like they were starring in a movie about forbidden love rather than committing adultery funded by fraud. Michael had captured them in parking garages with Julian's hand on Penelope's face in that gesture men use when they want to appear tender and romantic. He had photographs of them laughing together in ways that hurt to look at because Julian hadn't laughed like that with me in over a year. He had video of them in hotel lobbies, casual and comfortable with each other in ways that proved this wasn't a new relationship or a momentary mistake but an established partnership that had been running parallel to my marriage for months. Catherine showed me every photograph and I forced myself to study each one carefully even though they felt like small knives cutting into something I'd thought was already too damaged to hurt worse. I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting against and exactly what Julian had chosen over the marriage we'd supposedly built together. 2 weeks before our anniversary, Julian came home with unusual enthusiasm and announced he'd made reservations at Bellecourt to celebrate. He wanted to invite close friends, he said. Marcus and Victoria definitely. His brother Derek. Maybe a couple others who'd been important to us over the years. He smiled at me like he was planning something wonderful, and I smiled back while my stomach turned to ice and my mind raced through everything Catherine and I had discussed about what might be coming. I knew immediately what this dinner meant. Julian wasn't planning a celebration. He was planning a performance with me as the unwitting star of a show designed to humiliate and destroy me publicly while validating whatever narrative he'd constructed about our failed marriage. That night after Julian fell asleep, I called Catherine from the bathroom with the shower running to cover my voice. She listened to my description of Julian's plans and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said 3 words that changed everything. Let him try. Catherine and I spent the next 2 weeks preparing a counter-strategy that would transform Julian's theatrical production into his worst nightmare. She scheduled daily meetings at her office where we reviewed every piece of evidence Thomas and Michael had gathered, organizing it into a presentation that would tell the complete story of Julian's betrayal in a format impossible to deny or dismiss. Her technology specialist, a woman named Lauren who worked from a downtown office filled with equipment I didn't understand, provided me with a small wireless device disguised as an ordinary phone case. Lauren explained that it could connect to any nearby projection system and broadcast content from my phone without requiring physical access to equipment or cables. The device looked completely innocuous, just a slightly thicker case in matte black that wouldn't draw attention from anyone who happened to notice it. Catherine had also obtained access codes for the presentation system at Bellecourt through connections she didn't explain in detail. I didn't ask questions because some part of me understood that the less I knew about certain aspects of our plan, the better protected I would be if anyone later questioned the legality of what we were doing. Catherine assured me that broadcasting content to a restaurant's projection system wasn't illegal, especially when that content consisted of truthful documentation of fraud and infidelity. She said it with enough confidence that I chose to believe her. The presentation file Catherine created was a masterpiece of evidence and narrative. It opened with photographs Michael had taken of Julian and Penelope together, time-stamped and geotagged to prove when and where they'd been documenting their affair while I'd been home alone believing my husband was working late. Then came financial records showing the hidden accounts, the systematic transfers of money from our joint savings, the charges for hotels and jewelry and romantic dinners at restaurants I'd never visited. Email exchanges between Julian and Penelope scrolled across the screen in their own words, discussing their future together and their plans for after the divorce Julian had been orchestrating without my knowledge. The final section showed the forged mortgage documents with my signature that I'd never written, along with bank records proving that $200,000 had disappeared into investment accounts registered under Penelope Morrison's name. Catherine had even included a brief text overlay explaining what constituted financial fraud and forgery under state law, turning the presentation into something that resembled a legal brief as much as it did evidence of personal betrayal. She set the entire thing to music. Vivaldi's Summer from the Four Seasons, specifically the third movement that builds from deceptive calm into raging storm. The music gave the presentation a cinematic quality that made it feel less like a collection of documents and more like a story with rising action and inevitable conclusion. 5 days before the anniversary dinner, Rachel came to visit while Julian was at work. I'd been avoiding my sister for the past week because I knew she had concerns about what I was planning, and I didn't want those concerns to shake my resolve when I'd finally found the strength to fight back. We sat in the garden among the roses I'd been tending since we moved into this house. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves overhead, and the air smelled like summer and growing things that would bloom again next year regardless of what happened to the people who planted them. Rachel didn't make small talk. She looked at me with the directness that came from being sisters who'd survived our own difficult childhoods and knew each other well enough to skip past pleasantries. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" she asked carefully. "Once you hit that button at the restaurant, there's no taking it back. Julian will be destroyed publicly, and yes, he deserves it, but you'll have to live with being the person who did that." I looked at my sister and felt the weight of what I was planning settle on my shoulders in ways it hadn't before. Part of me, the part that had loved Julian 4 years ago when he proposed under those crystal chandeliers, whispered that public humiliation was cruel regardless of what he'd done to me first. That I should handle this privately with dignity and take satisfaction from legal victory rather than public revenge. That becoming the kind of person who destroyed someone else, even someone who deserved destruction, would change me in ways I might not be able to recover from. But then I thought about Penelope wearing my grandmother's necklace. About Julian laughing with his friends while planning to serve me divorce papers as entertainment for an audience he'd carefully selected to witness my humiliation. About the $80,000 he'd stolen while telling me we couldn't afford the kitchen renovation I'd been planning for 2 years. About the forged signature on mortgage documents that could have destroyed my credit and left me personally responsible for debts I'd never agreed to. "He chose to make this public," I said quietly. "He invited friends to watch him humiliate me. He planned this dinner specifically to destroy me in front of people who would validate his narrative about our failed marriage. I'm just responding in kind with the truth instead of lies." Rachel nodded slowly and squeezed my hand, but I saw the concern in her eyes and wondered if I was becoming someone I wouldn't recognize in the mirror afterward. Someone harder and colder and more capable of cruelty than the woman who'd planted these roses and believed in partnership and trusted her husband with family heirlooms that represented 4 generations of survival. "I just want to make sure you've thought about the aftermath," Rachel said. "Not just the legal aftermath but the personal one. You'll have to live with this decision for the rest of your life. You'll have to be okay with being the woman who did this to someone even if that someone deserved it." I didn't have a good answer for that because I hadn't thought much beyond Friday night and the moment when Julian's carefully planned humiliation would turn into his own public destruction. I'd been so focused on building the case and gathering evidence and preparing for the confrontation that I hadn't considered what kind of person I would be on the other side of it. Catherine insisted I practice the technical execution until I could do it smoothly even under the pressure and emotional stress of the actual moment. I spent 3 evenings in her office after work, learning to connect the wireless device to projection systems, authenticate access to networks, and launch the presentation file without fumbling or hesitation. The technology was simpler than I'd expected. The device disguised as a phone case created its own connection to nearby projection systems. I just needed to open the app Lauren had installed on my phone, select the network, input the access code Catherine had obtained for Bellecourt's system, choose the presentation file and press broadcast. 3 simple steps that would take less than 15 seconds if I executed them correctly. Catherine walked me through the sequence repeatedly, timing me with a stopwatch and making me start over whenever I hesitated or made a mistake. She treated the rehearsals with the seriousness of someone preparing for a military operation rather than a restaurant confrontation, and I understood that she was trying to eliminate any possibility of technical failure that would ruin the impact of what we'd prepared. On the 3rd practice session, I completed the entire sequence in under 15 seconds without a single error. Catherine nodded approval and set down the stopwatch. "Remember," she said, "wait until after you've signed the papers. Let him think he's won. Let everyone at that table believe the show is over and you've accepted defeat quietly like the compliant wife Julian expects. Then, when they're celebrating and toasting to new beginnings and recording your humiliation on their phones, that's when you press the button and show them what justice looks like. The night before our anniversary dinner, Julian came home earlier than usual. He walked through the door carrying grocery store roses. Nothing expensive, but the gesture surprised me after months of cold distance and minimal effort toward maintaining even the appearance of affection. He kissed my cheek and said he was looking forward to tomorrow's celebration, that he'd planned something special to mark our years together. The words were so perfectly calculated to sound genuine while meaning something entirely different that I felt something twist in my chest that might have been the last remnant of love turning into pure contempt. I thanked him and arranged the roses in a vase while he showered, listening to him hum in the bathroom like a man without guilt or conscience or any awareness that the woman arranging his flowers knew every detail of his systematic betrayal. He thought I was so stupid, so trusting, so completely absorbed in my own work and life that I wouldn't notice my marriage collapsing until he chose to officially end it on his terms in front of an audience he'd selected specifically to validate his narrative. That night we ate dinner together at our kitchen table. Julian talked about a project at his firm and asked polite questions about my work at the city planning department. We made small talk about weather and whether we needed to have the gutters cleaned before winter. We performed the routine of a functional marriage with enough skill that an outside observer would never have guessed that one of us was planning public humiliation while the other was planning public destruction. I watched Julian smile and talk and eat the dinner I'd prepared, and I wondered how I'd ever mistaken performance for genuine affection. How I'd believed in this man enough to marry him and trust him with my grandmother's necklace and plan a future that included children who would carry his name. How I'd been so completely fooled by someone who turned out to be nothing like the person he'd pretended to be when we met at that community fundraiser 4 years ago. When he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room holding my grandmother's favorite photograph. She was 25 in the picture, standing in front of a house she'd bought by herself after her husband died in the war. Her expression was defiant and strong, the look of a woman who'd survived something that should have destroyed her and came through it harder and more capable than before. "I won't let them take what's ours," I whispered to that photograph, and I felt her strength move through me like permission to do what needed to be done. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and temperatures perfect for outdoor dining. Julian woke early and dressed carefully in his best suit, humming while he adjusted his tie in the bathroom mirror like a man preparing for a celebration rather than a betrayal. I put on the emerald dress he'd once said brought out my eyes, applied makeup with steady hands, and checked my phone to confirm the presentation file Catherine had sent was downloaded and ready. The wireless device sat in its disguised phone case, completely ordinary and unremarkable, carrying the power to transform Julian's planned humiliation into his own public destruction. Before leaving for work, Julian kissed my forehead and said he'd meet me at the restaurant at 8. That I shouldn't be late for our special evening. I watched him drive away and felt completely calm. Not the calm of peace, but the calm of absolute certainty about what needed to happen next. I called Catherine one final time. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I've been ready for months," I answered. "Good," she said. "Then go show him what happens when you underestimate a quiet woman." I spent the afternoon at work pretending to review development proposals while actually running through the technical sequence in my mind for the 100th time. Open the app. Select the network. Input the access code. Choose the file. Press broadcast. 15 seconds that would change everything. At 6:30 I left the office and drove home to change into the emerald dress. The house felt strange and hollow, like I was already viewing it as something that belonged to my past rather than my present. I applied makeup carefully in the bathroom mirror, studying my reflection and wondering if the woman looking back would recognize herself tomorrow after everything that was about to happen. I arrived at Bellacourt at exactly 8 o'clock. The restaurant looked the same as it had 4 years ago when Julian proposed. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light across white tablecloths, dark mahogany paneling designed to make diners feel sophisticated and important. The quiet murmur of expensive conversations about business deals and romantic celebrations. I stood outside for a moment, taking one last deep breath of cool evening air before walking through doors that would close behind me on the life I'd been living and open onto something entirely different. The hostess greeted me with the professional warmth reserved for restaurants where entrees cost $40 and dessert required a second mortgage. She guided me through the dining room without needing to ask where I was headed. which suggested Julian had made arrangements for his performance to have maximum visibility. I spotted the table immediately. Large, positioned in the corner with clear sight lines from most of the restaurant. Impossible to miss. Julian sat at the center like a man holding court, wearing his most expensive suit and an expression of barely contained satisfaction. Surrounding him were the people he'd chosen as his audience. Marcus occupied the seat to Julian's right, wearing success-like cologne, expensive watch, tailored suit, the confident posture of someone whose business was thriving and whose moral compromises never kept him awake at night. His wife Victoria sat beside him, dripping in jewelry that announced her husband's financial status more effectively than any business card. She wore a smile that looked practiced and artificial, the expression of a woman who'd spent years perfecting the art of looking interested in conversations that bored her. Derek, Julian's younger brother, already had a drink in hand though dinner hadn't started. He specialized in inappropriate jokes and excessive drinking at family gatherings, the kind of person who thought crude humor made him entertaining rather than exhausting. His presence signaled that this evening would spiral into chaos, which was apparently exactly what Julian wanted. But the person who made rage flash through me so hot and sudden I nearly stumbled was Penelope Morrison, sitting directly beside Julian with her hand resting possessively on his arm. She wore a form-fitting black dress that left little to imagination, and around her throat hung my grandmother's diamond necklace. That necklace had survived the Depression when my great-great-grandmother refused to sell it despite having nothing else of value. It had survived World War II when my great-grandmother wore it to her husband's funeral and then used it as loan collateral to keep her children fed. It had survived my grandmother's divorce when her husband left for his secretary, and she'd built a business from nothing while wearing that necklace to every important meeting as armor against a world that tried to break her. Now it hung around the throat of my husband's mistress like a trophy she'd earned rather than stolen, glittering under Bellecourt's chandeliers while Penelope smiled at me with barely concealed satisfaction. I kept walking toward the table, keeping my face carefully neutral, letting them see exactly what they expected. The confused wife walking into an ambush without any idea what was coming. My clutch contained my phone with the wireless device attached, the presentation file already downloaded and ready, 3 steps away from transforming this performance into something Julian hadn't rehearsed. As I approached, Julian raised his champagne glass. His voice carried across nearby tables when he announced loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear that they should toast to new chapters and inevitable conclusions. The table erupted in laughter that sounded rehearsed and performative. Marcus raised his glass with obvious approval. Victoria tittered behind her hand like she was watching theater rather than participating in someone's destruction. Derek grinned and drank deeply, already playing his assigned role as the brother who validated Julian's choices regardless of their moral implications. I understood in that moment that they'd practiced this. They'd actually sat together before tonight and rehearsed how they would humiliate me, coordinating their responses for maximum impact and entertainment value. Julian reached into his leather briefcase, the one I'd given him 2 years ago for a promotion he'd celebrated by taking Penelope on a weekend trip he claimed was a work conference, and extracted a thick envelope embossed with a law firm's logo. He slid it across the white tablecloth with exaggerated ceremony, his movements theatrical and deliberate. "Happy anniversary, Sadie," he said, and the satisfaction in his voice was so thick I could almost taste it. This was his moment of triumph, carefully planned and perfectly executed, or so he believed. I picked up the envelope and opened it slowly, aware that every person at this table was watching my face for the reaction they'd come to witness. Inside were divorce papers, professionally prepared and already completed except for my signature. Bright yellow sticky notes marked every line where I needed to sign, as if Julian feared I might be too stupid to find them on my own without guidance. I read through the documents carefully while the table watched in anticipation. Julian was claiming no-fault divorce, requesting equal division of all marital assets despite the $80,000 he'd already stolen. He wanted me to pay half of all marital debts he'd actually incurred through fraud and financial betrayal. The papers requested I vacate our house within 30 days to give him time to sell it without the inconvenience of my presence. He was even asking for spousal support based on the claim that I'd been the higher earner during our marriage, which was technically true but only because he'd been spending our joint income on his mistress rather than contributing to household expenses. It was a masterpiece of audacity, and if I hadn't spent 8 months preparing with Catherine, I might have believed I had no choice but to accept these terms or face lengthy court battles I couldn't afford. Instead, I pulled a pen from my clutch and began signing every page with steady hands. The table watched in increasingly confused silence. This wasn't the script they'd written. The humiliated wife was supposed to cry or beg or demand explanations. She was supposed to fight back and create drama they could record on their phones and discuss later over drinks and social media posts about the spectacle they'd witnessed. I signed the final page, slid the papers back across the table and looked at Julian directly. "Thank you," I said quietly. "Thank you for making this so easy." Then I stood, smoothed the emerald dress Julian had once said, brought out my eyes and pulled out my phone. The wireless device disguised as a phone case activated the moment I opened the app. I selected the network, Bellecourt Events, the corporate presentation system Catherine had obtained access codes for through connections she'd never fully explained. I input the 8-digit code, chose the presentation file labeled advertiser-friendly.mp4, and pressed broadcast. 3 steps. 15 seconds. The large screen on the dining room wall that typically displayed the wine menu and dessert specials flickered from bright graphics to black. Julian noticed first. His expression shifted from satisfaction to confusion, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his mouth. Marcus stopped mid-laugh, the sound cutting off abruptly as he followed Julian's gaze to the screen. Penelope's hand tightened on Julian's arm, her perfectly manicured nails pressing into his expensive suit jacket. The presentation began with classical music filling the restaurant. Vivaldi's Summer, third movement, the section that builds from deceptive calm into raging storm. The volume was perfectly calibrated, loud enough to be clearly heard throughout the dining room but not so loud it felt aggressive or jarring. The first image appeared on screen. A photograph of Julian and Penelope kissing in his office parking garage, time-stamped with date and location data clearly visible. Then another image dissolved into view, them checking into the Riverside Hotel under names that weren't their own, the registration desk visible in the background with staff who would later confirm the booking when Catherine's investigator contacted them for statements. Then another photograph. And another. A comprehensive visual documentation of their year-long affair displayed on a screen large enough that every person in Bellecourt's dining room could see it clearly. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Other diners had stopped eating, forks suspended halfway to mouths as they turned to watch the screen. Conversations died mid-sentence. Servers froze with trays in hand, uncertain whether to continue working or stand still and witness whatever was unfolding. But the photographs were only the beginning of what Catherine had prepared. Financial records appeared next on that massive screen. Bank statements showing the hidden account Julian had opened without my knowledge, with systematic transfers of $500 here, $1,000 there, adding up to more than $80,000 stolen over 8 months. Credit card statements displaying charges at jewelry stores and hotels and expensive restaurants. Each purchase annotated with date and location and the name of the merchant who could verify what had been bought and for whom. Then came the mortgage documents. The papers Julian had signed using my forged signature to take out $200,000 against our house, with side-by-side comparisons showing my actual signature versus the forgery he'd created. Bank records proved where that money had gone. Into investment accounts registered under Penelope Morrison's name. Email exchanges scrolled across the screen in Julian and Penelope's own words. Her messages about being grateful he'd chosen her over his boring, career-obsessed wife who never appreciated him. His responses describing me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a person he'd once promised to love and honor. Their discussions about vacation plans and future living arrangements and the life they would build together once Julian finalized the divorce he'd been planning for months without my knowledge. Text messages followed, displayed in the familiar format of phone screenshots that made them feel immediate and personal. Julian promising Penelope my grandmother's necklace as an engagement ring once the divorce was complete. Penelope expressing excitement about wearing it publicly at our anniversary dinner as a symbol of her victory. Their casual cruelty preserved forever in messages they'd believed were private. The restaurant remained absolutely silent except for Vivaldi's music building toward its inevitable crescendo. Julian's face had turned a shade somewhere between white and gray, the color of someone experiencing shock and realizing simultaneously that everything they'd planned had collapsed into disaster. Penelope had released his arm and was attempting to sink lower in her chair as if she could disappear through the leather upholstery and escape through the floor. Marcus was staring at his phone where someone had apparently just sent him the video link. Because Catherine had built a simultaneous upload function into the presentation that was broadcasting everything to social media platforms in real time. Victoria's carefully applied mascara had started running as tears mixed with the realization that she'd participated in something now being documented and shared across the internet. Derek had actually pushed his chair back from the table, creating physical distance from the catastrophe he'd helped orchestrate. When the presentation ended, a final screen appeared. White text on black background, formatted like a legal document's title page. Julian Whitmore, financial fraud, forgery, theft of marital assets, and enough documented evidence to ensure you regret every decision that led to this moment. I looked at my husband and spoke quietly into the complete silence that had fallen across Bellecourt's dining room. You wanted an unforgettable anniversary. Consider this my gift. I placed my phone back in my clutch and walked toward the exit while behind me the silence that had filled Bellecourt's dining room shattered into chaos. Voices rose in confusion and accusation. Chairs scraped against polished floors as diners turned to get better views of the table where Julian sat frozen, his carefully orchestrated performance transformed into his own public destruction. The hostess stood near the entrance looking stricken, clearly uncertain whether she should attempt to manage the situation or simply stay out of the way. I walked past her without making eye contact, pushed through the heavy wooden doors, and stepped into cool evening air that felt sharp and clean after the suffocating atmosphere inside. Through the restaurant's large windows I could see Julian standing now, his hands raised in some gesture that might have been explanation or defense. Other diners had approached the table, phones still recording, asking questions I couldn't hear but could imagine based on their expressions and body language. One man in a business suit gestured toward the screen where my presentation had played, his face displaying the kind of outrage people feel when they witness financial fraud presented as entertainment during their expensive dinner. Marcus had his phone pressed to his ear, pacing near the bar with the aggressive posture of someone making calls that couldn't wait. Probably contacting his lawyer or perhaps his public relations consultant, already calculating how to distance himself from scandal that was spreading beyond this dining room into digital spaces where reputations were destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. His wife Victoria remained at the table, her face in her hands, mascara running in dark streaks that made her look older and more human than the polished facade she'd worn when I arrived. Penelope had fled. I'd watched her stand abruptly when the financial records appeared on screen, her hand releasing Julian's arm as she moved toward the bathrooms with the desperate speed of someone who needed to escape immediate visibility. The black dress she'd worn so confidently and my grandmother's necklace she'd displayed like a trophy had disappeared around the corner, and I wondered if she was crying or vomiting or simply hiding in a stall hoping the floor would open and swallow her into some dimension where her choices hadn't been broadcast to an entire restaurant of witnesses with recording devices. Derek remained at the table, alone now, finishing his drink with the deliberate focus of someone who'd decided alcohol was the appropriate response to disaster. Even he looked shaken despite his usual imperviousness to consequences and social judgment. His hand trembled slightly when he raised the glass, and I felt a strange moment of something that wasn't quite sympathy but wasn't satisfaction either. The valet brought my car within minutes, a young man who looked uncomfortable and avoided meeting my eyes directly. I tipped him $20 despite his obvious distress at having witnessed the scene inside, then sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. My phone vibrated with incoming messages. The first was from Catherine, sent just minutes after I'd walked out. Brilliant execution. Come to my office tomorrow morning. We finish this. The second was from Rachel. Holy hell, you're trending on social media. Call me when you're ready. I set the phone down without responding to either message and drove home through streets that looked exactly the same as they had 2 hours earlier when I'd driven them in the opposite direction. Traffic lights changed on their regular schedules. Other cars moved with normal Friday evening urgency toward restaurants and entertainment venues where their evenings would unfold in conventional ways without public confrontations or viral videos or marriages ending in spectacular fashion. I pulled into the driveway of the house Julian and I had shared, the place where I'd planted roses and planned renovations and believed I was building a life that would last. The windows were dark. The garden I'd tended for years looked peaceful in the dim light from the street lamp. Everything appeared normal and unchanged, which felt absurd given that nothing would ever be normal or unchanged again. I sat in the dark car for 10 minutes, unable to make myself go inside. My hands were shaking now in delayed reaction to what I'd just done. The calm I'd felt throughout the dinner and the presentation had evaporated, replaced by something that felt like shock mixed with disbelief that I'd actually executed the plan Catherine and I had prepared so carefully. When I finally walked into the house, the silence felt different than it had that morning. Heavier somehow. More permanent. This was no longer the home I shared with my husband. It was just a house that contained my possessions and memories of a marriage that had ended tonight in front of an audience that now numbered in the millions based on Rachel's text about trending on social media. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and occasionally checking my phone to watch the numbers climb. By midnight, the video had been viewed 2 million times. By 3 in the morning, that number had doubled. Someone at Bellacourt had recorded the entire presentation on their phone and posted it across multiple platforms with captions that varied but all told the same basic story. Wife serves justice at anniversary dinner. Cheating husband gets what he deserves. Watch karma happen in real time. The comment sections filled with thousands of responses. Most were supportive, people sharing their own betrayal stories and praising me for standing up publicly rather than accepting humiliation quietly. Women wrote about husbands who'd cheated and stolen and lied, expressing vicarious satisfaction at watching Julian's careful plans collapse into documented evidence of his fraud and infidelity. Men wrote about being blindsided by partners they trusted, finding validation in my refusal to be destroyed quietly. But not everyone approved. There were accusations that I'd been cruel, that public humiliation was never justified regardless of what someone had done to deserve it, that I should have handled this privately like an adult instead of destroying Julian's reputation and career for revenge that served no purpose beyond making me feel powerful. Some comments suggested I was vindictive and cold, that my actions revealed character flaws as serious as Julian's betrayal, that I'd lowered myself to his level instead of taking the moral high ground. I read those criticisms and felt something complicated twist in my chest. Part of me wondered if they were right, if I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, if the satisfaction I'd felt watching Julian's face turn gray had transformed me into someone I wouldn't recognize in the mirror tomorrow. Then I remembered Penelope wearing my grandmother's necklace like a trophy she'd earned rather than stolen. I remembered Julian's satisfied smile as he slid those divorce papers across the table. I remembered the $80,000 he'd taken from our joint accounts while telling me we couldn't afford the kitchen renovation I'd been planning. The doubt hardened back into certainty. He'd chosen to make my destruction public entertainment. I'd simply responded in kind with truth instead of lies. Catherine called at noon on Saturday with news delivered in her characteristically direct manner. No pleasantries or questions about how I was handling the aftermath. Julian's architectural firm had released a statement announcing his immediate termination following revelation of financial impropriety and conduct unbecoming of their professional standards. The statement expressed shock and disappointment, referenced their zero-tolerance policy for fraud, and assured clients that this individual's actions did not reflect the firm's values or practices. Penelope had been fired as well, her career as an executive assistant effectively over since background checks would now permanently link her name to fraud scandals and affair documentation that existed in video format across every major social media platform. No reputable company would hire someone whose poor judgment and participation in financial crimes had been broadcast to millions of people. Marcus had dissolved his business partnership with Julian within hours of the video going viral. Not from moral outrage or ethical awakening, Catherine explained, but because the association had become toxic to his own reputation and client relationships. Marcus released his own statement expressing shock at his former partner's deception, painting himself as another victim who'd been fooled by Julian's fraud, carefully omitting his presence at the anniversary dinner where he'd laughed and raised his glass to my public humiliation. "They're protecting themselves," Catherine said. "Expected behavior from people who care more about appearance than ethics. But it works in our favor. Julian has no professional allies left, no income, and a viral video ensuring no reputable firm will hire him. His bargaining position is non-existent. We can dictate terms now." Rachel arrived at my house Saturday evening carrying takeout food from the Thai restaurant we'd loved as teenagers and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than she should have spent. Both items sat untouched on the kitchen counter while she studied my face with the concern that came from being sisters who knew each other well enough to recognize when normal social responses had been replaced by shock. "Are you okay?" she asked, and I realized I didn't know how to answer that question honestly. I wasn't crying. I wasn't collapsing into the breakdown she'd probably expected. Instead, I felt hollowed out, emptied of everything except a strange calm that felt less like peace and more like the emotional numbness that follows trauma. Rachel sat with me in the living room and asked the question I'd been avoiding asking myself. "Do you feel better now that you've done it?" I thought about Julian's gray face. About Penelope fleeing to the bathroom. About 5 million people watching the presentation I'd prepared with such methodical care. About the comments praising my courage and the comments condemning my cruelty, and the strange reality that both perspectives felt partially true. "I feel like I did what needed to be done," I answered carefully. "Whether that makes me feel better is a different question." Rachel nodded slowly and opened the wine, pouring 2 glasses even though neither of us typically drank much. She handed me one and settled into the chair across from where I sat on the couch. "You scared me a little tonight," she admitted. "When I watched that video, I saw someone I didn't entirely recognize. You were cold, Sadie. Controlled. Nothing like the sister who used to cry during sad movies." I took the wine glass and stared into the dark red liquid without drinking. "Maybe," I said quietly, "that sister couldn't survive what Julian did. Maybe I had to become someone else to get through this." Rachel stayed with me that night, sleeping in the guest room like she had during difficult periods of our childhood when one of us needed the other's presence more than conversation. The next morning, she made coffee and sat with me at the kitchen table while I prepared for my meeting with Catherine. The legal proceedings that followed moved with surprising speed. Catherine had constructed a case so thoroughly documented and legally airtight that Julian's attorney spent their first consultation advising him to accept whatever settlement terms we offered rather than face a judge who would review the evidence and react with predictable fury. I learned this later from Catherine, who had sources within the legal community that provided insights into opposing counsel's strategies and recommendations. The hidden accounts Julian had created were frozen through emergency court orders, then seized and liquidated with funds returned to me along with substantial penalties for fraudulent transfer of marital assets. The second mortgage he had taken out using forged documents bearing my signature was voided entirely, with Julian held personally responsible for all associated debts. Nearly $200,000 he now owed to the mortgage company with no income or assets to satisfy the obligation. The settlement terms Catherine negotiated were comprehensive and punishing. I was awarded the house on Maple Street with sole ownership. No requirement to buy out Julian's supposed equity given that he had already stolen far more than any equity share would have provided. Both vehicles were transferred to my name. All retirement accounts we had accumulated during the marriage became mine exclusively. Catherine argued successfully that Julian had forfeited any claim to marital assets through his systematic fraud and theft. Additionally, I was awarded substantial spousal support based on Julian's previous salary at the architectural firm that had terminated his employment. The judge calculated the amount using his income from before he was fired, not his current unemployment status, reasoning that his loss of income resulted directly from his own fraudulent actions and should not reduce his financial obligations to the spouse he had defrauded. The court hearing where these terms were finalized took place 3 weeks after the anniversary dinner. Julian sat beside his attorney looking diminished in ways that went beyond the obvious financial and professional destruction. He had lost weight. His expensive suit hung loosely on a frame that appeared to have shrunk. The confident posture I had known throughout our marriage had collapsed into something that resembled defeat but might have been simply exhaustion. The judge who reviewed our case was a woman in her early 60s named Margaret Thornton, with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings and particular intolerance for financial fraud. She barely concealed her contempt when addressing Julian directly, asking how he had justified forging his wife's signature on mortgage documents while conducting an affair funded by marital assets he was systematically stealing. Julian had no answer that did not make him appear worse. He stammered something about mistakes and poor judgment and circumstances that had spiraled beyond his control. Judge Thornton cut him off mid-sentence and said that adults were responsible for the circumstances they created through their choices, and that claiming loss of control was an insult to her intelligence and to the court's time. The entire proceeding took less than 90 minutes. When it ended, Catherine shook my hand in the courthouse hallway and said I had won everything possible under the law. She looked satisfied in ways that suggested professional pride in the quality of the case she had built and the outcome she had secured for her client. I felt nothing except a strange emptiness that I could not explain to Catherine or to myself. The most personally satisfying legal victory involved recovering my grandmother's diamond necklace. Catherine had filed theft charges against Penelope Morrison, arguing that Julian had no legal right to give away property that belonged to me individually rather than to our marital estate. The necklace had been inherited before our marriage, making it separate property under state law regardless of where we had stored it during our years together. The police retrieved it from Penelope's apartment during a search conducted as part of the broader financial fraud investigation. Detective Harrison, a patient man in his 40s who had handled property crimes for 15 years, delivered it to me at Catherine's office still sealed in an evidence bag marked with case numbers and dates that documented its journey through the legal system. When I held that necklace again after months of knowing Penelope wore it like a trophy, I cried for the first time since discovering Julian's betrayal. Not from sadness exactly, but from relief that something precious and irreplaceable had been recovered from wreckage that had consumed so much else. The tears surprised me with their intensity, coming from some place deeper than the controlled anger that had sustained me through preparation and confrontation and legal proceedings. I had the necklace professionally cleaned and appraised at a jewelry store downtown that specialized in estate pieces and antique restoration. The jeweler was an older man named Samuel who handled the necklace with the careful respect it deserved, examining each diamond under magnification and researching the setting's origin through reference materials he kept in leather-bound volumes behind his counter. The appraisal revealed that the necklace was worth significantly more than I had known. Nearly $30,000 based on the quality of the diamonds and the craftsmanship of the platinum setting. My grandmother had been more resourceful and financially successful than family stories had suggested, or perhaps she had simply understood the importance of investing in something beautiful and portable that could serve as emergency funds if circumstances required. Samuel asked about the necklace's history while he cleaned it, and I told him what I knew. For generations of women who had survived betrayal and hardship and rebuilt their lives from nothing. My great-great-grandmother who had refused to sell it during the Depression despite having nothing else of value. My great-grandmother who had worn it to her husband's funeral and then used it as loan collateral to keep her children fed. My grandmother who had worn it to business meetings as armor against a world that tried to break women who dared to build success on their own terms. Samuel smiled and said it looked like a survivor's necklace, which felt exactly right. I wore it home that day, and every time I caught my reflection in a window or mirror, I saw my grandmother's defiant strength looking back at me from my own face. But winning legally and recovering what had been stolen did not feel the way I had imagined during those 8 months of preparation. I stood in my kitchen one evening about 2 months after the anniversary dinner, surrounded by everything I had fought for. The house was mine. The financial security was mine. The justice Catherine had promised had been delivered in full measure through court orders and settlement agreements that left Julian with nothing except debts he could not pay and a reputation he could not repair. Julian was destroyed exactly as I had planned. His career was over. His reputation was permanently damaged by a viral video that would exist on the internet forever, resurfacing whenever anyone searched his name for employment or personal reasons. His relationship with Penelope had apparently ended within weeks once the money disappeared and reality replaced fantasy. I had achieved complete victory, and it felt hollow in ways I could not articulate even to myself in the privacy of my own thoughts. Rachel found me sitting on the kitchen floor that evening, not crying or having any visible breakdown, just sitting in the dark because I lacked the energy to turn on lights or move to more comfortable locations. My sister let herself in with the key I had given her months ago and found me there among the shadows. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice carrying the worry that came from recognizing that something had broken in ways that legal victories could not fix. "I won," I said quietly. "I got everything I wanted. The house. The money. Justice. Everything Catherine said we would get. So why do I feel like I lost something important too?" Rachel sat beside me on that kitchen floor like she had months earlier when I had first discovered the betrayal and come to her apartment unable to process the scope of what Julian had done. She did not offer easy answers or reassuring platitudes because there were none that would address what I was actually asking. We sat there together in the dark for a long time before either of us spoke again. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a letter forwarded through Catherine's office. Julian had written from his brother Derek's house where he was apparently staying, having lost the apartment he had rented with money stolen from our accounts and unable to afford new housing given his unemployment and the substantial debts he now carried. The letter was 6 pages long, handwritten on lined notebook paper in Julian's familiar script that I had seen on anniversary cards and grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen counter during years when I had believed we were partners building a life together. He claimed he had made terrible mistakes, that the affair had been a midlife crisis he regretted deeply, that the financial fraud had spiraled beyond his control once he started down that path. He said he understood why I had exposed him publicly and accepted that he deserved the consequences that had followed. But he asked if there was any possibility of forgiveness, not for reconciliation but for his own peace of mind, so that he could move forward without carrying the weight of knowing I hated him. I read that letter once, then filed it in a drawer with all the other documentation from our divorce. Catherine had advised against responding to any communication from Julian, and I followed that guidance without hesitation. But late that night I pulled the letter out and read it again, searching for something I could not name. Remorse perhaps. Real accountability rather than excuses. Recognition of the person he had destroyed rather than focus on his own suffering and need for absolution. All I found were justifications wrapped in self-pity and requests for forgiveness that centered his peace of mind rather than the damage he had caused. I burned the letter in my fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken, turning 6 pages of apologies that arrived too late to matter into ash that disappeared up the chimney into night air. The ash from Julian's letter settled in the fireplace, and I sat watching the last fragments glow and fade until nothing remained except the faint smell of burned paper. The symbolic gesture of destroying his request for forgiveness should have felt cathartic, but instead it left me with the same hollow sensation that had accompanied every victory in this process. I had won everything legally possible, but the emotional resolution I had expected never materialized. 6 months after the anniversary dinner at Bellacourt, I stood in my newly renovated home office overlooking the garden where roses bloomed in colors my grandmother had planted decades before I was born. The house was mine now in ways that went beyond legal ownership documented in court filings and property records. Every room had been systematically redecorated to erase traces of Julian's presence and preferences. I had painted the master bedroom a soft gray that felt calming rather than the bold navy Julian had insisted would be sophisticated. The furniture we had chosen together during optimistic early years of marriage had been sold or donated, replaced with pieces I selected alone based purely on my own aesthetic preferences without compromise or negotiation. Artwork I had been collecting quietly for years, stored in closets because Julian found it too abstract or too feminine, now hung on walls throughout the house. The kitchen renovation I had planned for 2 years while Julian stole our savings to fund his affair was finally completed using money from the divorce settlement. New countertops in pale quartz replaced the dated laminate. Updated appliances included a professional-grade range I had wanted but Julian claimed was excessive for someone who was not a chef. A breakfast nook with windows overlooking the garden provided space where I sat most mornings with coffee and silence, reading newspapers or simply watching birds visit the feeders I had installed. The transformation had been expensive, consuming a substantial portion of the settlement funds Catherine had secured. But the cost was necessary for my survival in this space. I could not continue living in what felt like a museum preserving a failed marriage. I needed to create something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed, to inhabit rooms that reflected the person I was becoming rather than the person I had been when I believed partnership meant accommodating someone else's preferences at the expense of my own. The garden became my primary form of therapy during those months of renovation and emotional reconstruction. I spent hours on weekends digging in soil and pruning roses, pulling weeds and planting new varieties that would bloom in colors Julian had never seen. Watching things grow under my care in ways my marriage never had provided tangible evidence that careful attention and proper conditions could create beauty even from ground that had been neglected or damaged. My grandmother would have understood this need to rebuild through physical labor, to create something beautiful from circumstances that should have destroyed me. She had done the same after her husband's death and again after her divorce, pouring grief and rage into businesses and properties and gardens that outlasted the men who had tried to break her. My reputation at the urban planning department changed in unexpected ways following the viral video that had now been viewed over 15 million times across multiple platforms. Colleagues who had previously dismissed me as passive and accommodating now treated me with respect that occasionally bordered on wariness, as if they had seen something in me they had not known existed and were uncertain how to interact with this revealed capacity for strategic destruction. I was promoted to senior project manager 3 months after the divorce finalized. The promotion came with assignment to lead the downtown redevelopment initiative I had been advocating for years, a project involving coordination between city government, private developers and community organizations to create affordable housing without displacing existing residents. My supervisor Margaret, who had always been cordial but maintained professional distance, called me into her office to deliver the news personally rather than through the usual email announcement. "You stood up for yourself when it mattered most," Margaret said, her tone suggesting she was sharing something important rather than simply making conversation. "That takes strength we don't often see, especially from people who've been underestimated. I think you'll bring that strength to this project." The promotion included a substantial salary increase and access to resources I had been denied previously when male colleagues with less experience had been given preference for high-profile assignments. I threw myself into the work with intensity that surprised even me, spending weekends reviewing development proposals and meeting with community leaders, designing solutions for neighborhoods that had been neglected too long by city planning processes that prioritized profit over people. The work became more than career advancement. It became proof that I could build something meaningful from destruction, that the same strategic thinking and careful preparation I had used to destroy Julian could be redirected toward creating positive change in my community. Catherine Brennan and I developed a genuine friendship that extended beyond our professional attorney-client relationship. She called periodically to check in, and we met for dinner at quiet restaurants where we talked about work and life and the complicated nature of justice in cases where legal victory did not necessarily produce emotional healing. She told me during one of these dinners that she used my case as an example in consultations with other clients considering divorce, presenting it as proof that preparation and patience could transform victimhood into victory. But she also admitted, her tone becoming more careful, that she worried about me sometimes. "You won everything legally," Catherine said. "The house, the financial settlement, the complete destruction of Julian's career and reputation. But I want to make sure you're winning personally too. Revenge is satisfying, but it's not the same as healing. Those are different processes and one doesn't automatically produce the other." Her words stayed with me for days afterward, circling through my thoughts during morning coffee and evening garden work. I realized that I had been so focused on legal victory and public vindication that I had not considered what came after those goals were achieved. I joined a support group for people recovering from betrayal and financial abuse, meeting every Thursday evening in a church basement with folding chairs and donated coffee. Listening to others share stories similar to mine provided perspective I had not found in legal victories or viral videos. These were people who had been destroyed by partners they trusted and were now engaged in the difficult work of rebuilding identities and lives from that destruction. I started pottery classes on Saturday mornings at a community center across town, something I had always wanted to try but had never made time for during my marriage when weekends were consumed by Julian's preferences and schedules. Working with clay provided a different kind of therapy than gardening, the satisfaction of creating functional beauty from raw material through patient attention and willingness to accept imperfection. I reconnected with friends I had neglected during my marriage, women I had known before Julian who had gradually disappeared from my life as I accommodated his social preferences and professional obligations. Rebuilding those friendships required acknowledging that I had allowed important relationships to atrophy, accepting responsibility for choices I had made even while recognizing that those choices had been influenced by dynamics I had not fully understood at the time. 1 year after the anniversary dinner at Bellacourt, I stood in my bedroom wearing my grandmother's diamond necklace and looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror I had installed during the renovation. The woman looking back was different from the one who had walked into that restaurant believing her marriage could be saved through optimism and accommodation. I had become harder in some ways, more suspicious of easy trust, quicker to recognize deception and self-serving behavior in others, less willing to give people the benefit of the doubt when their actions contradicted their words. These changes felt like losses of innocence or optimism that could not be recovered. But I had also become stronger, more certain of my own worth independent of someone else's validation, less willing to accept treatment that diminished me or to accommodate preferences that required me to become smaller or quieter. more capable of strategic thinking and careful preparation when facing challenges that required sustained effort rather than immediate emotional response. The revenge I had taken on Julian had been complete and public, and exactly what he had planned for me turned back on its architect with interest. Whether that made me a better person was a question I had stopped trying to answer because the framework itself seemed wrong. Better than what? Better than whom? The question assumed moral absolutes in situations that were far more complicated than simple judgments of right and wrong could address. I had done what I needed to survive. What I needed to reclaim power that had been stolen through systematic lies and financial fraud and casual cruelty. People often say revenge accomplishes nothing, that forgiveness represents the higher path, that taking the moral high ground produces better outcomes than descending to the level of those who wronged you. Maybe they are right in abstract terms. Maybe I should have signed those divorce papers privately, accepted the betrayal with dignity, and rebuilt my life without the dramatic confrontation that had now been viewed by millions of people I would never meet. But Julian had chosen to make my humiliation a public performance. He had selected that restaurant and invited that audience and planned every detail of my destruction for his entertainment and validation. He had handed me divorce papers in front of his friends and his mistress wearing my grandmother's necklace, expecting me to collapse into tears that would justify his narrative about our failed marriage. I had simply responded with truth instead of accepting the role of passive victim he had written for me in his story. I walked away with everything that mattered. My home. My career. My grandmother's necklace. The knowledge that quiet women who are pushed too far can become forces that reshape the landscape around them. The anniversary dinner Julian planned as my ending became his instead. I learned that the best revenge is not served cold, but served publicly with evidence, in front of everyone who thought you would simply accept defeat. Julian wanted to forget me and build a new life with Penelope. Instead, he will remember me every single day for the rest of his life. That turned out to be satisfaction money simply cannot buy. If this story of calculated justice and reclaimed power had you completely captivated, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Sadie calmly signed those divorce papers before revealing the presentation that exposed everything Julian had done. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more compelling stories of betrayal and redemption like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.